We need coalitions of open countries and of liberal countries to fight against kleptocracy, to fight against money laundering. He wants the right to say, I am sovereign, and so I can invade Ukraine, and I can destroy the Ukrainian state, and you can't stop me. I should be able to do whatever I want. So unless Ukraine has real security guarantees, maybe NATO troops in Ukraine, maybe NATO membership, some genuine security, and why would anybody come back to Ukraine? Or why would anybody rebuild Ukraine? Because Russia will remain a threat. I mean, unless Russia is defeated, if something happened to Putin tomorrow, would they defend him? I don't think so.
Демократическим обществам по всему миру противостоит сплоченная группа диктатур. Националистов Путина, левых популистов Мадуро и Лукашенко или иранских исламистов объединяют не идеи, как это было во времена Холодной войны. Объединяют их неуемное желание править и экономические интересы. Об этом в своей новой книге «Корпорация автократов. Диктаторы, которые хотят править миром» пишет лауреатка Пулитцеровской премии, американская публицистка Anne Applebaum. Для того, чтобы обогащаться, вести свои войны и платить своим силовикам, автократы используют западные технологии и западные банки. Как не дать корпорации автократов победить? Об этом мы поговорим с автором книги, исследовательницей авторитарных режимов Anne Applebaum. Miss Applebaum, I'm glad to see you here, and thank you very much for accepting our request.
Большое вам спасибо. I will speak English for the sake of ease, but I can.
Yeah, I know that you speak many languages of our region, but just for the purposes of this interview, we agreed to speak English. My first question concerns the concept of this book. You assume that there is an interconnected group of autocratic regimes which are helping each other in shattering global order. Who are the members of this Autocracy Incorporated, and how do they challenge the global order?
First of all, the three most important are Russia, China, and Iran. But there are many helpers, weaker countries who contribute. North Korea, I write about Venezuela, I write about Zimbabwe. You could probably at this point add Azerbaijan. You could add a group of countries in West Africa. You can add Cuba, of course, Nicaragua, Myanmar, and the list goes on. What you just said in your introduction is correct. They are not united by ideology. These are very different kinds of countries. They have different goals. Some of them are one-man states. Some of them have a ruling party. I would make only one correction, which is that you said they're united by financial interests, which is true. That's one of the things that unites them. I would say they're also united by a determination to push back against the liberal world. In other words, the language of rule of law, the language of rights, human rights, the idea of transparency or accountability. All of those things are for them very dangerous. And of course, they hear that language from their own internal opposition. They also hear it from Europe, America, Japan, Australia, and they're seeking to undermine that language as well as the group of the democratic world that produces it. So it's not just money. There is an idea behind it. It's just that it's not a positive idea. They don't share a positive idea. They share a negative idea. We need to destroy liberal values.
Yeah, and another question concerning this book. We have this book in Polish. We have of course, English version of the book. Will it be translated into Russian, Ukrainian, other languages of the region?
I know that it's definitely being translated into Ukrainian already. Russian, maybe, it depends. There's a couple ideas about how to do it. It has been or will be translated into 26 other languages. So it's in all the European languages. I think I have a Taiwanese edition. I think I have a South Korean edition. I think I have an Israeli edition. So there are a lot of even non-European languages as well.
So all the languages of the countries which can be threatened by this Autocracy Incorporated. You partially mentioned this concept of anti-universality or protection of dictatorship against the liberal values. Vladimir Putin, in his propaganda, openly said that in Ukraine he's not fighting Ukrainians, he's fighting so-called collective West. So this degenerated liberal West. But do the collective West really exist, or it's another imagination, another propagandist cliché from Stalin's time?
I mean, collective West is the wrong word. I mean, there is something like a democratic world. There is a world of countries who share a set of values and who have similar political systems, who are capable of working together, and who have gathered together to support Ukraine. So that's true. I mean, it's not true that the West is put all of its fighting forces into Ukraine. You know, unfortunately, it's just the Ukrainians fighting. So this image of, you know, that the Russian army is fighting the West is ridiculous, because they're not. They're fighting the Ukrainian army, who have some foreign weapons. But actually, the idea of a collective democratic world is one of the things I write about in the book as something that we need. We need coalitions of open countries and of liberal countries to fight against kleptocracy, to fight against money laundering. We need a coalition of open countries to think more deeply about how the internet should be run, how it should be regulated so as to be compatible with democracy and not destructive. And, you know, and of course, it looks like we need coalitions of democracies who can fight, who can begin to deter lawless violence, who are prepared to push back against states that want to invade and disrupt other states, whether through conventional military or through terrorism. And we do some of that, but I'm not sure we do quite enough.
I would like also to ask the question, continuing this topic of authoritarian propaganda. The authoritarian regimes, they constantly say that they are fighting for national sovereignty and against the Washington's attempt to enslave their people. So what does the sovereignty really mean for Vladimir Putin, and what do the Washington really wants from Russians?
Putin means something very specific when he talks about sovereignty. And he means he has the sovereign right to do whatever he wants inside his own country. He can arrest people, he can destroy people, but he also wants the right to do the same thing outside of his country. He wants the right to say, I am sovereign, and so I can invade Ukraine, and I can destroy the Ukrainian state, and you can't stop me. I should be able to do whatever I want. So sovereignty, in his mind, and this is a very specific Russian thing, isn't something that every country enjoys. Ukraine does not have sovereignty. You know, I think in his mind, even Europe doesn't really have sovereignty. Only countries that can invade other countries have sovereignty. And his view of the world is that there shouldn't be any restraints on that. He's allowed to invade Ukraine, to invade, I don't know, Moldova, to invade whoever he wants, and we don't have the right to say anything about it. That's his vision, that strong countries get to do whatever they want. And of course, that's diametrically opposed to the concept of the United Nations that was invented after the Second World War, which said that borders are not changed by force. And of course, it's also diametrically opposed to all of the assumptions we have about modern Europe. You know, Europe had this terrible experience of 2 world wars that were started by imperialist countries seeking to impose their system on others. And after the Second World War, everybody decided never again. It's not productive. It doesn't create prosperity. We want to be a continent that doesn't, without imperialism. And what Putin is doing is he's bringing back an older idea of European conquest. I mean, the Russian invasion of Ukraine is an imperial invasion that seeks to destroy the Ukrainian state and Ukrainian identity. I mean, that looks to us like it could have happened in the 1940s or indeed in the 19th century. So his idea of sovereignty is that we should return to a kind of, literally, it's a kind of 19th century idea of great nations or big nations that can do whatever they want. I mean, and when he talks about what's, you know, our idea is that there should be something called universal rights, and that there is something called human rights that everybody enjoy, and people have the right to free speech, but also a kind of dignity. They have a right to justice. All of that, he wants to get rid of that. That's what he means by changing the world order. Getting rid of the idea that there is such a thing as universal rights. He doesn't want there to be universal rights. He wants only only the people who have the most power to be able to make all the decisions.
But what about these claims that Washington especially wants something from Russians, from, I don't know, Venezuelans, etc. So what are the interests of the European Union, of the United States in Russia?
So, I mean, right now our interest from Russia is that Russia leave Ukraine and go back to its borders because Russia is threatening European security. And so the reason why Europeans are rearming, the reason why Sweden and Finland join NATO, the reason why we now talk all the time about the military and defense, why we're going to build up our defenses, is to protect Europe against Russia. So obviously if Putin can invade Ukraine, then he can invade anywhere. And actually, the Ukrainians have right now the best army in Europe. And so he's fighting the best army. What if he invades somewhere else that has a weaker army? We have to be prepared for that and begin to think about it. So in a way, Putin has re-inspired the rearmament of Europe, and in a very profound way. What else do we want? What do we want from Venezuela? We want Venezuela to return to the path of rule of law, to stop producing poverty and refugees. You know that there are more refugees have left Venezuela than have left Ukraine. It's a country that was the richest country in South America. Now it is the poorest country in South America. It's been completely destroyed by a kleptocratic mafia state regime which then creates problems for everybody else. Refugees, poverty, instability, all of that is what Venezuela now produces. So of course it's in the interest of Venezuela's Latin American neighbors, but also of the United States, that Venezuela become once again a better run place on the path to prosperity.
So can we say that just authoritarian regime automatically produced problems for the neighbors?
Of course they do. I mean, any country that produces instability and violence, which Venezuela and Russia both produce instability and violence, creates trouble for people who live nearby. I mean, 10 years ago, there was nobody in Poland who was worried about war with Russia. Okay, now they do. And it's not because they are more warlike, it's because Russia's actions have made people worried and afraid. So now they're, as I said, building up their arms industries, they're making ammunition, things that we didn't do 10 years ago.
But what to do with this authoritarian regime? So in your book, you describe how Russian military, political, economic help allowed Alexander Lukashenko, Nicolas Maduro to crush peaceful protests in their countries. So does it mean that the era of non-violent revolutions has definitely gone? And what after?
I don't know if it's definitely gone, but it's clear that the autocratic regimes are better prepared now to fight these revolutions, both because of surveillance technology and internet technology that gives them greater control. They can see what's happening in the population better, but also because they've understood that they need not only to fight these individuals, they need to fight these ideas. They need to fight the idea of rule of law, the idea of justice, the idea of freedom, and above all, it's interesting, they need to fight the idea of optimism and of hope. Because when people are hopeful, when they're optimistic, when they believe change is possible, then they're willing to cooperate together to make that change. And this is what especially Putin and his friend Lukashenko, especially they try to do, is to destroy people's hope. Instead, to make people feel cynical, nihilistic, nothing can ever change, or even if we did change, maybe things are bad here, but in the West it's worse. That is their idea, to build, above all, to build apathy. They want people to be apathetic. They want people not to care about politics. They want people not even to know about politics. They want people to say, I can't do anything about that. I give up. And that's actually the core of their propaganda when you listen to what they say. The core of their propaganda is just to persuade people to stay home.
There is no better world, just everybody is the same corrupt as us.
There's no better world, and that's one of the reasons they're always looking backwards. Not, they talk about the great past, or they talk about, Peter the Great, or they talk about, the glory of even of the Second World War. And they talk about that because that's, they don't want people to look forward.
But you say that democratic countries should not fight authoritarian regimes, they should prevent autocratic behavior at home and abroad. What does it mean? What measures should be taken to prevent this, to weaken this authoritarian corporation?
So one of the things I write about in the book is changing our own laws so as to make this process of laundering and hiding money much more difficult. So we could eliminate these anonymous companies. We could end the ease with which people can keep their money in tax havens. So many of the tax havens are British, actually. You know, the British could put a stop to that economy. You know, in the British Virgin Islands or in the Cayman Islands. So there are many things that we could do to make our own system tighter and make it less easy to exploit. That's in some ways, I mean, that would just that would be a great beginning, because a lot of the world's dictators hide their money inside that kind of offshore world.
But you say that the dictators are much better prepared for popular uprisings. Should the democratic world be also better prepared and, I don't know, instead of deep concerns, give freedom fighters money to buy, I don't know, Bayraktar guns? It's a provocative question, but, you know.
I'm not going to advocate that we support violence. I mean, the U.S. has a bad record of trying to change regimes by violence, and I think mostly we shouldn't do that. Clearly we are helping the Ukrainians fight for their sovereignty, and which is also a fight for democracy and for freedom, and also it's a fight for rule of law, because that's one of the things that's at stake in the war. And I'm also in favor of us helping other opposition movements to the extent that it's feasible and possible. I mean, and we do, actually. Probably not to the extent that the regimes imagine, but that we should help people be able to just exercise their rights, that people should be able to, speak and write and publish freely. I mean, yeah, I think we should help them with that.
Talking back about Russian and Chinese wealth and dictatorship wealth in general, the economic power of Russia and China are built on Western technologies and the trade with the West.
The assumption in the 1990s was that it was going to be possible to trade with Russia and with China in a politically neutral way. That it could be mutually beneficial. You know, we trade with you, you trade with us, everybody benefits. And that was and people believed that, and I should say people in Russia believed this also. You know, I knew many Russians who also thought that trade with the West would eventually make Russia more liberal or more democratic, or at least more open to the world. And they also hoped that this trade would do that. And actually, even for a while, it worked. You know, in the 2000s, it was still somewhat working. However, and also in China. However, I feel that there was a moment when the regimes changed. In Russia, I think it started earlier, but it began to kind of crystallize after 2014, after the Maidan revolution in Ukraine. In China, it began to change when Xi Jinping began his rise to power, and they became much more instrumental about how they used our trade, and much more systematic about using it to enrich and empower themselves. So actually in China, it probably began earlier in this process of stealing Western, intellectual property, and doing so systematically in a way that would help the Chinese state and would help the Chinese military. The Russians also from the beginning, were using this Western financial system to enrich particular people, to create the state that we now know as Putinism. And these were things that the West, or America and Europe, should have seen much earlier. As it became clear that, the economic changes in Russia were not benefiting most Russians, or were not, creating, a more fair society, and were instead enriching a small group of, Siloviki and former communist and KGB operatives. We should have blocked those avenues of change. I mean, clearly, somebody asked me the other day, I mean, what about, the Chinese make a lot of toys. They make a lot of plastic toys, and those are exported to the West. Is that bad? Well, maybe not. I mean, I can see that there are some forms of trade that are legitimate, and I don't think we should cut off all trade, and anyway, it's not a practical thing to call for right now. But trade in high technology, trade in chips, allowing the Chinese, for example, to invest in ports and other kinds of, infrastructure, this was a mistake. And the mistake is still reversible. People began to notice it a few years ago and began to start to block these kinds of investments, but we need to do it much more systematically.
Are the politicians, in your opinion, in Washington, in Brussels, ready to listen to your advice and take the measures you propose?
Of course, I want everybody to listen to my advice, but so some people are, not so much my advice, but I mean, some people are aware of this phenomenon and some are not. It's a difficult thing if you're an elected politician to tell your constituents that there is a real threat to their security, and it appears also in the economy, and the things that we need to do to fight it are expensive and difficult. So it's expensive and difficult to build more weapons. It's expensive and difficult to change our relationship with China so that we have, our economy is more secure. I think people are beginning to understand it. In the US, actually, this argument about China is now understood. And actually, I think in Europe, people understand much better. I mean, since 2022, they understand Russia much better too. So there is a change. We're in a different world now than we were, I'd say, even 3 years ago. But has there been a full recognition, a moment when we really transform our economies and our political thinking? That hasn't quite happened yet.
Now, diplomats in the European Union, in Ukraine, are discussing the possibility of a new peace summit with the participation of Russia. Basically, they are discussing the possibility of peace negotiations with Russia. In your opinion, what will happen if this war just freezes at the present front line? How it will affect Ukraine? What will be the outcome for Europe and the whole world?
So, first of all, I mean, I hear this thing about negotiations, and actually I've been hearing it for 2 years, so this is nothing new. I'm sure there are conversations that go on with Russia all the time, so I'm not sure there's anything new to discuss. Secondly, I still don't understand, and nobody has explained this. You want to freeze the conflict. How do you make Russia stop fighting? I mean, okay, we could make Ukraine stop fighting, right? We could pressure them, we're their allies, but how do you make Russia stop fighting? And I haven't heard anyone tell me how that's going to happen, because it's only when Russia stops and really when Russia begins to pull back that we can talk about the war being over, because it's Russia that's still moving, right now as we're speaking, still trying to move forward. So I don't understand how these negotiations make Russia stop. And secondly, even if Russia stopped, and even if Ukraine stopped fighting, and even if we somehow froze the conflict on the current border, then what happens? Because unless Ukraine has real security guarantees, maybe NATO troops in Ukraine, maybe NATO membership, some genuine security, and why would anybody come back to Ukraine? Or why would anybody rebuild Ukraine? Because Russia will remain a threat. I mean, unless Russia is defeated, or Russia comes to the realization that the war was a mistake, which could happen, it does happen. For example, France made a decision to end the war in Algeria. There was a colonial war in Algeria. It went on for many years, and the French decided finally it wasn't worth it. This will happen eventually in Russia. So unless they've come to that decision, then why should anybody believe the war is over? I mean, why won't Russia just rearm and invade again in 2 years? And so I still don't hear anyone explaining to me either why should Russia stop, and secondly, how do we ensure that peace is permanent? You could have a ceasefire, okay, then what? And I don't hear this answer, and so I'm waiting for it.
In your opinion, how long this confrontation between authoritarian regimes and liberal world will last? Is it for decades?
Decades, for the rest of our lifetimes.
And yeah, really, I was born in Perestroika time, and I really believed that my generation will see this bright future, but...
I mean, the first thing I did in my career was I wrote about the fall of communism in Poland. I was here in 1989, and that's what I wrote, and I also believed it or hoped it anyway. But yes, no, I think this confrontation is now real. I mean, and it will last for a long time. I mean,
we are coming to the conclusion of our interview. It's very interesting, but yeah, still we have limited time. In your opinion, the politicians in this West, are they thinking about the post-war Europe, new shape of at least Europe?
Post-war meaning after the Ukraine war? I don't know that people have got to that stage yet. I mean, people are talking about post-war Ukraine. I mean, I've heard the conversation about what could be done to rebuild Ukraine. That's real. I've also heard a conversation about European defense and how to think differently about that. I think right now nobody believes that an end of the war in Ukraine would be an end to this military threat from Russia. And so people are preparing for that as a long-term possibility and a long-term threat. I don't know whether there's a bigger plan than that.
So it means, for instance, that the regime of Alexander Lukashenko may enjoy this gray zone and oppress its own people for decades?
I think the way that the war ends would have a lot of impact on Belarus. So again, a victory for Ukraine would be a severe blow to Belarus. Obviously, a change in the nature of the Russian regime would also change Belarus. I mean, Belarus is now completely dependent on Russia in all kinds. I mean, I don't have to tell you this, in many different ways. And so I do hope that the processes that have been unleashed by this war will eventually change that country too. It's a real tragedy. Belarus is a European country. It should be prosperous. It has talented people. It's very well educated. It's mostly a very peaceful nation. It doesn't have any military ambitions of its own. There is no reason why Belarus should now be one of the most horrific, brutal regimes, on the continent. And it's my hope that the Belarusian people really deserve better.
And my last question for today, about change in Russia. Despite all our efforts, the majority of the population, passively or actively, according to the opinion polls, still support the war against Ukraine.
We don't know that. We don't know that. When you're in Russia and you answer opinion polls, who are you? Somebody calls you up on the phone and they say, Vladimir Vladimirovich, do you support the war? What are you going to say? Of course. So I would be very careful about this support for the war. Remember, we're talking about this very apathetic population that doesn't take part in public life, that isn't involved in public conversation. What they support or don't support is still very unclear. There was a very interesting moment at the time of the Prigozhin rebellion in Russia when he marched into Rostov and with his men and this armed vehicles, you remember, there was no popular uprising. Nobody came to object to him. Nobody said, these mercenaries are coming to take over our city, we need to fight back. No one did that. So there is they're passive about the war, but they would also, if something happened to Putin tomorrow, would they defend him? I don't think so.
And in long term, what should be done from the Western side, from the Russian side, to transform Russia into a peaceful neighbor in Europe?
A political system which didn't have imperialism at its heart, a leader who didn't imagine himself as the new incarnation of Peter the Great, even just simply think a leader of Russia who cares about Russia and who's interested in Russians and Russian prosperity. This for me would be enough. What's dangerous about Russia is its insistence on imposing its imperial vision on its neighbors and on the world.
Let's hope that one day it will happen. Thank you very much for accepting our request and for this really interesting conversation.
Thank you so much.
А нашим зрителям я напомню, что наши гости, или точнее, мы были в гостях у экспертки по авторитарным постсоветским режимам, лауреатки Пулитцеровской премии Anne Applebaum.